Hey everybody, it's your friend Adam. I'm here with Paul Vander Klay and Drew Welty, and the topic of discussion for this debate is God real? Now I kind of dropped this on Paul like just now he seemed to realize that we're in a debate. I talked to him about opening arguments and whatnot. So he is taking the affirmative in this. I think he might be winging it a little on the opening argument. So be ready for that. But we are going to stick to our standard format where Paul is going to give an opening argument for about 5 minutes, 10 minutes, whatever he takes. Like he wants to, I want to hear his argument, then I will steelman his argument and counter his argument as best I can. And normally from there, it usually devolves into a free-flowing discussion. So Drew Welty is here producing / moderating. He'll have eyes on the chat. We'll do super chats at the end if there's any questions, or just you can at Drew if you have any questions. He'll set them aside. I am going to do another live stream with Paul where we're going to watch together Brett Weinstein and Alistair McGrath talk. And I was telling Paul beforehand that I think he's a little straw manning Brett's argument. So be sure to subscribe and tune in for that, because it should be an interesting debate. I'll be watching it from the Christian atheist perspective. Paul will be watching it from the Christian perspective. So that should be fun. I am also talking to Destiny on Sunday. PSA Sitch, my partner in crime, is actually going to be out of town. So in lieu of our normal Sunday stream, I'm going to be talking to Destiny, and I'm going to be giving the secular case for objective morality. Destiny had done a debate with Tom Jump, and Tom Jump's case for objective morality, I love Tom to death, but it's incomprehensible. I mean, I hesitate to use the word salad because it's thrown at us so much, but that stuff is, what does he talk? What is Tom Jump smoking? So I'm going to try to give Destiny the evolutionary argument for morality, and oh, nice, my cell phone's going off. So tune in for that. That should be fun. And I guess, do you want to say anything before we begin, Paul, or you just want to jump into an opening argument?
Oh, let's do it.
Okay, so Paul, you are up. What is your opening argument? I have my pencil. I have my notepad right here. I'm ready.
Okay. So the question is God real? And the answer is yes.
Now, all right. Let me steelman your argument.
So I think it's vital to ask the question, what do we mean by this little 3-letter word God? And what do we mean by this 4-letter word real? Now, my definition of real is basically that which governs. The thing that is most real is the thing that governs. I think implicitly in these conversations, when we hear this word real, we tend to think that which is material. But in most of our lives, that which is not material, which is essentially me or you, not in terms of our bodies, but in terms of our minds, in terms of our identities, which cannot be pointed at in a material sense exclusively, that which governs, for example, that which governs my hand is my mind. Now, my brain is certainly involved, my body is certainly involved, but that which governs is perhaps my desire to have a drink, my desire to move the microphone. So that is what's real. So that's my shorthand definition of real, is that which governs. Now, God. Now, you and I, Adam, have spoken quite a bit about Jordan Peterson. One of the things, so I've made a lot of videos about Jordan Peterson. I'm going to continue to make videos about Jordan Peterson. I've also been making videos about John Vervaeke, who is another professor of psychology at University of Toronto. A lot of people are less interested in Vervaeke, partly because Peterson is such a good speaker and so much fun to listen to and so provocative. But Peterson and Vervaeke are basically engaging in the same philosophical question, which, as Daniel Dennett noted, is probably the most important philosophical question we've been dealing with in the last 40, 50 years, which in non-mythological terms is called the frame problem. And the frame problem was discovered when engineers tried to create robots and electronic eyes that see. Well, you can hook up a camera to a room, but to actually create a machine that can engage with the physical world, or even just simply a two-dimensional image of the physical world, they began to discover that there's a lot more going on in our mind that has to do with comprehending this physical world. Now, what John Vervaeke has laid out sort of in academic terms, and Jordan Peterson has laid out in mythological terms, is in a sense the frame problem. And the frame problem is essentially this: in order to see the world, we always develop some sort of a value hierarchy. If I would walk into my office today and there was a tiger in my office, suddenly I wouldn't see anything else in my office but that tiger, because my brain would automatically focus on that tiger and say, that tiger doesn't fit. If I were to walk into my office and my main office computer was gone, immediately it would grab my attention because someone has broken into my office. We deal with these frames so naturally, so implicitly, that we barely pay attention to them. But what both Peterson and Vervaeke have been going on about, and essentially what Peterson engaged Sam Harris with in his talks with Sam Harris, is that this frame problem is always with us. And essentially what Peterson laid out to Sam Harris, and I don't think Sam Harris really understood it in their conversations, is that in many ways that frame is related to what the Western tradition has always called God. Now, that's a very difficult thing for people to understand, because right now in our culture, people have associated God as an old man in the sky, someone that we make a wish to and should answer those wishes. And so most of the discussions about whether or not there is a God center around the question, is there a wish fulfiller in the sky that I can have special access to if I go to church every week or promise not to masturbate or whatever? Now, historically, Christianity has understood God, I would say, to be, I've split it up into what I've often called God number one and God number two. God number one is, in a sense, the system of all systems, and God number two is the person of all persons. And whether or not we understand what the West has always meant by this word God, a big part of Jordan Peterson's point is that this God is always functioning within us, and we are always functioning within the frame of this God. And so, because one way to understand God is, in fact, the system of all systems and the person of all persons, and that, in fact, we cannot operate in this world without a frame, we do it completely naturally, I would assert that this God is, in fact, very real. And the reason Jordan Peterson caught the attention that he did was because he actually managed to reframe God in a way that his audiences could understand. And even without them understanding why they started to do it, they began getting interested in Christianity. Even though, let's say, like in your case, Adam, you would say, well, I'm a Christian atheist. Well, that's because you're essentially saying, I'm down with God number one, but I'm skeptical about God number two, that this God is a being that I can relate to personally and has the aspects of personhood, such as agency and mind, in the same way that my brain has mind and colonizes my hand. So there's an argument for you.
Okay, I might have trouble steelmanning this argument because I'm not exactly sure what you mean. I understand that which governs, okay? And if you're saying that God, which would be a Petersonian God, definitely, then I totally agree with you. That God is real, but I would just call that God evolution, because evolution is what governs. There's reproduction, variation, and selection. and religions evolved to facilitate groups towards more successful survival and reproduction. So if you're saying that that which governs is God, then I mean, I can steelman that argument. I can argue all day on that argument. The frame argument, I'm not exactly sure what you mean, because it seems a bit of a non sequitur. Okay, I understand Peterson's argument, and you and I both understand it far better than most of the people who are criticizing Jordan Peterson. The world is a complex place. There are so many facts in the world that in order for us to digest all of those facts, we have to hierarchically order them. And the way that we hierarchically order them is a value system, in essentially. So I agree with you there that there are these value systems that have evolved that are context for understanding and believing in God, but I don't necessarily know how that is an argument other than this is just another way to conceptualize God for an actual belief in God. We never really got into, you mentioned two different definitions of God. My understanding, my reading of the evolutionary science on this stuff is people want the wish fulfiller God. And you kind of brushed over that. You said, I'm not certain that you included the wish fulfiller God in your two definitions of God. Can you clarify that?
Well, I think, his Christianity has, when I say God number one and God number two, those are two aspects. Okay. Christianity has them both. I think you, Adam, have, in a sense, one aspect. Mm-hmm. You are down with God number one, and we should get into the question about what is evolution.
Right.
But you are skeptical about a God that you can relate to as a person.
Well, I'm skeptical of wish fulfiller God. I'm not skeptical of either of the gods. I'm not skeptical of the frame God. I'm not skeptical of that which governs God. So I think you know that as a Peterson fan. And we disagree on why Peterson became popular, especially with a lot of atheists. And you've mentioned this in a number of your videos, that he's taking Sam Harris's audience away from him, because Jordan Peterson delivered Sam Harris's religion, and just Sam Harris doesn't know it. Sam Harris has often said, I want a religion that I don't have to believe in any bullshit. Like, pardon my language, but that's Sam Harris's language. And the religion that Peterson has given atheists a way to value religion without it being true. This is something Brett Weinstein often calls metaphorical truth. So the reason why I call myself a Christian atheist is because I believe religion is metaphorically true. It's true, or as Peterson would call it, true enough. But I don't think that it's literally true, and that is really the difference of opinion. And I think a lot of the evidence supports the fact why it's important for a lot of people that it is literally true. And I understand and completely respect that. There's a reason why on movies they say based on a true story, because it means more to us. It's like, this is something that really happened. This is something that we can believe is real. So I don't necessarily believe that, but I still see religion as a product of evolution. That we're going to be looking at the talk between Brett Weinstein and Alistair McGrath. And in that talk, Weinstein brilliantly illustrates that these religions evolve through a process, a kind of product cycle, and they go together as a group. So when you take them apart and pick parts and make your own religion, the idea that is going to be a functional belief system in the world is fairly laughable. It's the same idea that if you just randomly threw genes together, you're going to get a competent organism. So I think the way forward is to start looking at religion in this way. And I often bring this up with religious people, is because the process that has developed these religions over time has been blind. We have an opportunity to take the reins on that. And I know you're a fan of Haidt, and Haidt in his famous paper, The Emotional Dog and Its Rational Tale, he says, our moral intuitions are often wrong. And I think even as a theist, you'll believe our moral intuitions are often wrong. Religions come out of the fact that we have these moral intuitions. They get codified into religious tradition. those religious tradition are also filtered through interpretation through the church. Those ideas are very much an intuitive process. Until we bring an empirical aspect into them, we are still just guessing. Now, I watched a recent video that you had on, I can't remember what it was, but you were framing religion a lot as back or potentially forward looking. I think it was a video that you did on the Alistair McGrath, Brett Weinstein talk. But I would argue that without some kind of empirical study, religions can't ever be forward looking, that they're always going to be looking towards the past. And I think in the situation that we're in now, we have to be more forward looking. So there's a lot to digest there. I'll give you a chance to respond.
Okay. What's your definition of religion?
So religion and morality, I kind of use the same definition. It's a set of rules that binds a group of people into a cooperative group.
See, I don't see religion primarily as a set of rules. Mm-hmm. Religions tend to have moral codes, but I see religion more as governing narratives that frame our lives, actions, behaviors, and meanings. And the reason I look at narratives is because narratives themselves are richer and fuller than rules. For example, you have the 10 commandments, and one of the commandments is you shall not kill. To tell a story where there's a murder affords far more both meaning and understanding than just a rule about killing. Because one of the things that you always have to deal with rules are that there are rules only function when they are apt to the context, and narratives are far fuller in affording a context within which the rule is intelligible and seen as right and afforded value. So I would assert your definition of how religions have emerged in time, I don't really have a problem with. I would assert that in a certain sense, John Vervaeke has a very interesting video on the relationship with what he calls relevance realization and Darwinian evolution. Because in a book that Jordan Peterson recommends, The Metaphysical Club, there's a key passage in that book that really opened my eyes to understanding what Darwinian evolution asserts. And it asserts that essentially Finchness is the variable, not the outcome of the change, the interchange between context and organism. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
And that's really key, because when we look at a finch, we say that's a finch. And when we have in our minds a certain concept of what finch is, but what happens in adaptation is that certain elements of this finchness get variable in order to afford this specific organism or this group of organisms the capacity to change and adapt to their environments. And so Darwin's key insight, and I think, again, the book, The Metaphysical Club, really makes this clear, is that finchness itself is a variable. And so, okay, so how do religion and evolution correlate? Well, you could understand religion as governing stories which develop out of contexts in order to afford the community adaptive advantages over their competitors.
Okay.
I think that's a definition of religion you could agree with.
Yeah, definitely. It sounds like my definition.
Right. And I have no problem at all with that definition.
Okay, just to double back to what you said about narratives not being rules, narratives are heuristics to embody rules, to embody behavior, and also they add to the enforcement side. Like you said, if the rule is just, don't kill anyone, it doesn't have as much power if we build a narrative around the guy who could have killed somebody and didn't, showed him mercy, and that gave him status within the community. Then all of a sudden you're putting some enforcement mechanism behind this thou shalt not kill, because somebody in that position may think, well, I will increase my status if I don't kill, if I show mercy. So I think we're really talking about the same thing here. We're still talking about rules, and I don't have a problem with including narratives in. Actually, I think narratives are part of the reason why religion is so effective. Like, you have the secular humanists trying to create their own religion, like, without any narratives. They have no understanding of how the enforcement side of the equation works.
Well, I'd say it's not even just enforcement. If I were to ask you, what exactly are you? Now, right away, we're in the middle of the frame problem, because if I'm asking, what are you, you might say, well, I am, you might give me a physical description of yourself. And then I would say, well, were you when you were 3 years old and just a portion of your size? And you might say, well, you'd say, well, it depends what you mean by you. But the one of the things that I think most of us understand ourselves to be is this ongoing autobiographical narrative, which is in our mind, which affords us identity and actually affords us continuity over time. And our bodies change. We grow fatter or thinner. We grow larger or smaller. We're healthy, unhealthy. But, as my grandmother said to me once when I was visiting her in college, she said, when I look in the mirror, I see myself and I wonder, why on earth am I encased in this 90-year-old body? Because inside I feel like I'm 21. Now, I think that gives us a key insight into what a human being is, that in many ways, a human being is a story. And this is the reason religions in the form of narratives have been so effective in terms of the scope of human history, because we see ourselves as stories. And so we're nested within stories, and it's stories that give us meaning, identity, that give us life in many ways. And so that's why religions, in fact, I think, are best understood as stories, and the rules fit into that story. But I don't want to get caught up on rules versus story too much, because that, in a way, is beside the point. But I don't have any disagreement that religion affords, via stories, a meaning, a meta meaning by which a culture with a shared story can, in fact, outcompete competitors with other shared stories. And you and I talked about before Germany and the Second World War. Germany had a very complex, Nazism had a very complex self story that embedded within it were ideas about racial evolution. And the West had different complex stories that didn't have that, as you and I would agree, an erroneous assertion about the nature of racial evolution. And in the context of the war, the other powers succeeded in conquering Nazi Germany. And that's a way in which I would assert that religion is something that is implicit in every large story, because it's a story that affords meaning, it's a story that affords identity, and it's a story that locates us within a far larger cosmos that gives us reasons upon which to base rules. For example, in Nazi Germany, it was perfectly permissible to kill Jews because of their evolutionary story. That was not permissible in other societies because of the story. Okay. And so I don't have a challenge with you on this nature of religion. But this is where, in a sense, you and I are probably going to talk about in the Brett Weinstein thing. What Brett Weinstein is doing, whenever we frame a problem like, oh, humanity is abundantly conflictive, and within that conflict, now with these greater powers that we have of nuclear weapons and such, we're going to destroy ourselves. You have just framed reality within a story that will become a religiously governing story, which will find application in rules underneath that in enough time will likely be shaped via story evolution within a mythology, and given enough time, it will be easily recognized as a religion. Now, God, this little three-letter word, is what is naturally, as Jordan Peterson laid out to Sam Harris, the aspect in that story that is doing the selecting. Now, the reason Darwin made such a splash, and again, the Metaphysical Club, this book recommended by Jordan Peterson, makes that clear. The reason Darwin made such a splash is that Darwin was basically asserting this process is blind. In other words, there is no being that has intentionality through that process to deliver an outcome. That was simply a religious assertion. There's no way to prove or disprove that assertion. Now, what I'm saying is that, in fact, in this move, Darwin contributed to the far longer split within the idea of God, that there is, in fact, something that is selecting between us. And I would argue that a great many people find this so natural that even if they, for reasons of status in our culture, get rid of the word God, they immediately start slipping into language which is completely in keeping with the historical use of the word God. They'll say things like, the universe brought me this opportunity. So it's just substituting universe for God.
I don't mean to cut you off. Adam, do you think you could steelman his argument, or are you still unclear about what he's saying?
I'm pretty unclear on his argument. I would like to invoke Godwin's law and win this debate immediately, since someone is talking a lot about the Nazis here. And I also want to make the distinction here that a narrative about evolution is totally, completely, categorically different than the actual process of evolution, correct? You're saying that the Nazis had this bad evolutionary narrative. That doesn't necessarily mean evolution.
No, that was your assertion in our last conversation.
Well, no. I am saying that the narrative that the Nazis had involving evolution is completely detached from the actual process of evolution. Like,
it's complete. Yeah, it's completely it was their narrative of evolution.
Right. But you couldn't make
in fact, you can't locate the processes that happened biologically in the past without a narrative.
This is Brett Weinstein, the case that Brett Weinstein is making, though. He is saying that if you build your belief system upon a narrative, and that is not necessarily a good narrative, a narrative that has been through an evolved process, like the Nazis did, that could end in disaster. It could end in ruin, which it did for the Nazis. So I'm just making the distinction between the narrative. I am in favor of the Christian narrative. I think the Christian narrative is awesome. I think the science supports the fact that the Christian narrative is a great narrative. But the argument that you're making, I don't see how. I mean, if you're making the argument that God is the selection mechanism in evolution, then debate over. We agree. That is the Jordan Peterson God, and a lot of the contention over Jordan Peterson is that he won't validate the Christian narrative because the Christian narrative is much different. I am under the impression that I'm a little uncertain, and I don't think the science is clear on this, if belief in the wish fulfiller God is a necessary part of the narrative. So,
a necessary part of which narrative?
The Christian narrative. Whether or not Christianity works as a religion, and I would argue that it's rather ironic here, but Sam Harris wants to base his moral system on well-being, and Christianity evolved to maximize well-being. So So I think he's trying to invent a religious system, a moral system that will deliver as much well-being as Christianity does, but without a belief in the wish fulfiller. And I am unclear if that is even possible. I mean, at this point, I would argue that it isn't. But what I want to acknowledge some of the points that you made, because you're talking about how we naturally go to this belief in God. And I agree with you. I think that's one of the reasons why these religions work. But that just because we naturally go to that belief in God it's not evidence that God actually exists.
Okay, what do you mean by God when you used it in that sentence?
Well, the wish fulfiller God, I think, is what we're zeroing in on.
Okay. One thing that you have to recognize in Christianity is that at its center, you have the Son of God in the Garden of Gethsemane that asks his Father if it might be possible to avoid the humiliating, degrading, and painful torture and death that he was immediately anticipating, and God abandons him on the cross. That's at the center of historical Orthodox Christianity. And so any assertion that even the full-blown Christian God is simply subject to our wishes has to be thrown out of Christian court.
Okay, so you're saying that Christianity, the wish fulfiller God, is not a part of Christianity?
I'm saying that the relationship between our desires and God's agency in fulfilling them is far more complex than wish fulfillment or even Freud's projection theory.
Well, I think I agree with you. I don't necessarily know
Good.
the Freud stuff, but
what I think is helpful is to get down to exactly where you and I disagree.
Okay.
And I think there are a number of word frames in which we would say, let's use the word natural and supernatural. Because you would say, well, if you said that God is the language that we use to have done the selecting exhibited in the biological fossil record, resulting in the world as we know it, that's a God I can agree with, because something has done selecting and here are the outcomes, right? And that's in a sense God number one. And when Jordan Peterson when Sam Harris, they get to the end of the first Vancouver talk, and Sam Harris is like, wait a minute, we haven't talked about God. And so Jordan says, okay, and he opens up his computers and he reads this list of things. Included within it, it's this God who's doing the selecting. And Sam Harris says, no, wait a minute, that's not what I mean by God. That's not what Christians mean by God. And that's exactly where Sam Harris reveals his ignorance about religious history, because that is very much not only what Christians have meant by God, but nearly everyone means by God, even if they substitute the word universe for God. That's one aspect of it, which is why I switch it. I didn't delineate it between God number one and God number two. And so what I hear you saying is, if you call the thing which selects via biological evolution God, I'm down with that. What I'm not down with, is that true? Have I steelmanned your argument?
Yeah, we both agree that God is real. We definitely agree that God is real, but other people want, and maybe we should turn to materialism, because a lot of people want to believe that there is a God that created the universe that is in some sense real, that exists outside of the material universe, what you would call the supernatural. One of the problems that I have is a lot of theists attack materialism, and I've even heard you do this in some of your videos. But from an atheistic perspective, it seems like your worldview is built on the top of materialism, and I don't understand why you would attack, in a sense, something that's of no consequence. If there's a supernatural realm outside of the material world, it doesn't change anything within the material world. And the best atheistic arguments in favor of the secular utility of Christianity are materialistic arguments. So at the same time, it feels like you're taking the best arguments that would be convincing to skeptics.
Well, let's again pay some attention to some terms. When we talk about the natural world, what types of processes do we assume that we are using the word natural to describe?
Things that we can empirically study.
Okay, things that we can empirically study. Things that, in a sense, happen on their own.
Yeah.
Let's say gravity, it doesn't matter how many times I lift this cell phone stand, it will do the same thing. And I can measure the rate at which this falls. We call this natural, right?
Right.
And what naturalism, I'm getting this from C.S. Lewis's book, Miracles. What naturalism asserts is that from the initiating moments of the universe as we know it, that there has been a cascade of processes that have led things in and of themselves blindly from that point to this point. And everything that we know and see in this world, theoretically, no one could possibly be able to do this, of course, but theoretically could account for everything with naturalistic terms.
Mm-hmm.
That is naturalism.
Mm-hmm.
And within that, Darwinian biology, there is no designer who establishes and desires outcomes and ensures that outcomes will be achieved, but rather this process is blind. That's what I understand Darwinian evolution to assert.
Well, the wish fulfiller God could have set up the program to do everything without manipulating it after the fact. So you could still have the wish fulfiller God in a materialistic world. So that's why I don't understand the attack on materialism.
The difficulty with materialism then comes in with the question about what are we and what are we doing? Because here's a funny feature about us. So this is in a sense the difference between God number one and God number two. I had a long conversation with John Vervaeke about this thesis. Someone began repeatedly challenging me in my videos about the differentiation between something that is complicated and something that is complex. This is a differentiation that came about in business terms. And basically, my car engine is complicated in that it is a series of moving parts. But if I put the right type of gasoline in it and I have the right oil and it's in the right aerated environment, all of that machinery will work together in a predictable way to achieve a certain amount of horsepower. That is complicated. Managing an office full of human beings is complex because each one of those human beings has desires, intention, all of this stuff that we associate with personhood. Now, here's the question. Are all of those persons, in theory, completely accountable to a closed set of processes that can be brought all the way back to the Big Bang?
Well, I would argue yes. Obviously, I'm a materialist. So
okay. So then you also would be with Sam Harris in denying free will.
No, I think Sam Harris is wrong on free will, but
okay. So then the question is, where in your system does free will come from? How can it be discovered via evolution?
I don't want to really derail the conversation on a topic on free will.
Yeah.
But just to steelman your argument here before we go to questions, you're saying, in the immortal words of Jordan Peterson, God is that which selects, and that God is real.
That's right.
Yes, I completely agree. The that God is definitely real. The wish fulfiller God is the God that Sam Harris has a problem with. I'm not certain that God is real. So do you want to move on to questions? You want to? I mean, I feel like you could steel man my argument, Paul. I mean, if we have the same argument.
I think I understand your argument. I think you're saying that if at the beginning of history, a God designed the world to unfold in this way, in this naturalistic way, this God would be in some ways inconsequential to our world apart from his original designing of it. Because one of us in the midst of this world wouldn't really need to or couldn't reach out of it to ask that God to change the pattern.
Well, it depends upon how the world was designed, obviously. Like if you think of God designing the world like a video game, he could still come in at any given time. Like he could do it Matrix style. He could take over a person. He could do whatever you see in any of the movies. So it doesn't necessarily mean that a God couldn't be doing that. One of the things that I think is interesting is I think both of these narratives can exist from two perspectives. But one of the problems that I have is just the theists keep attacking materialism. And I don't necessarily know why they're attacking materialism, other than the fact that they want to say that that they think materialism leaves God out of the equation. I feel like the God is built on top of the back of materialism.
Well, I think they attack materialism because the difficulty in, let's say, the all planning God, the deist God, who essentially this is at the heart of deism, which was an intermediate step before secularism, that a God makes the world, winds it up, sets it in motion, but leaves it alone, is the question of our freedom, our freedom of thought and our freedom of action, and the type of way that we, as sort of these mental narrators, interact with the unfolding of all of these naturalistic processes.
Right. Okay.
That's why theists often say, okay, well, I'm completely with you in terms of a God who can design a world in which processes would unfold in such a way and give us all these rare constants that actually make life possible. But then we have the question of, do we ourselves have freedom? And it's at this point that, Sam Harris is actually being fairly consistent with his logic in that we're delusional in imagining that we have freedom, but we really don't. Whereas theists will say, no, we believe we actually have freedom. And in fact, Sam Harris's assertion and admonitions that we be reasonable implies we have the capacity to either be reasonable or not. And what that means is that now you're asserting human agency. And once you assert human agency, you have opened the door to the question of, are there other agents, especially an agent that in fact designed and produced the physics in such a way that it would unfold in the way that we've seen it.
I don't understand why humans having free will, having agency, infers that there is an agency outside of the material world that created everything. Why is the fact that we have agency any indication that a God exists? It seems like a non sequitur.
I think it's for the fact that nearly every purely pantheistic mythological movie script has to betray itself at some point. And my favorite example of this is the movie Avatar, because you have this whole movie and we're all part of the process, and you're in the middle of this living planet, and the living planet, which is supposed to be just the collective brain of the thing itself, decides now to fight against these, imperialist people looking for unobtainium to destroy the planet. You have the same problem in the narrative of Star Wars, in that, well, the Force is just the collective consciousness of all living things. Well, that which employs the Force is therefore, by our initial definition of real, more real than the force. The fact that in this world, we can sufficiently colonize things in the world and bend the world to our wills suggests that will is more real than dead matter. And that then suggests that, well, where did this consciousness come from? Perhaps God number one is the system of all systems, but God number two is the person of all persons and the source of all consciousness. And that's why theists always make that turn.
So you're saying your argument is that free will or choice is somehow metaphysical, and that free will or choice implies that there is a metaphysical realm where God exists. That's your argument.
I'm saying that we started out with the definition of real. Real is the thing that is able to colonize and determine and govern.
Mm-hmm.
It is clear that consciousness governs matter.
Right.
Therefore, it is reasonable to assume that there is a consciousness governing the matter in the world in which we live. We do it. Look at the technology, the books, the frames, everything. We're very capable of it. Now, what we assert, what I think saying there is no God number two, atheism says is that we are the governing consciousness of this world. And I'm skeptical about that, because it would be, the world is a strange enough mystery. It would be an even stranger mystery to imagine that we're at the top of the food chain. And if that is true, then I would have to be in the kind of existential terror that Brett Weinstein has.
Well, this has been a fascinating conversation. Let's go to some questions. What do you say, Paul?
Sure.
Yeah, okay, so I'm going to start with the questions from the super chat. Okay, so we have I think it's pronounced Job. It may be Job, but I think it's Job. For €2. This is for Adam. It says, Adam, in your life, do you act as if God is real?
Yeah, I'm a Jordan Peterson Christian all the way. And the way that I look at it is very much from a Jonathan Haidt, Moral Foundations, social intuitionist framework. I was socialized as a Christian, and I've internalized all of these narratives to the point where they're basically unconscious for me. So even though I rationally do not believe God exists, if I lie to people or cheat people, I can't sleep at night. In order to avoid that horrible feeling that I get, I just don't do it. So I think but I made this argument before, Paul, and maybe you've heard, I think it's somewhat of a moral failing that Christianity kicks people out of the tribe because they no longer believe in the literal truth of the Jesus narrative story. And I equate it to Christmas. I know this is incendiary to some Christians, but the reason why we have Christmas is to teach children about generosity. They internalize this truth about generosity by believing in this Santa Claus character. Just because they discover Santa Claus is not real, we don't take away Christmas from them. And I feel like it's kind of a moral failing of Christianity that they do that. Judaism doesn't do this. Many atheists are still Jews. And I think a lot of this anti-theist debate is a result of that. You've kicked a bunch of people out and they're determined to burn down the village. I'm trying to stop that. So do you want to respond to that at all, Paul?
Of what you said or what Job asked?
Just either. Well, the super chat primarily.
I mean, anybody who's watched my channel understands how eager I am to have conversations like this one, because I think that actually, in many ways, the form of atheism we are encountering in our world, in the Western world, is in fact in a very strange way, and I'm going to get heat for this, in a strange way, a variant of Christianity.
Well, definitely for those that have been raised Christian, like myself.
But even, I think there's even the framing, the fact that this kind of atheism only arose in late stage, mostly Protestant, well, no, Catholic countries as well, but in late stage Christian countries asserts, because if you travel to other places in Africa and Asia, their atheism is not like Western atheism. And so I think you can make a historical argument that actually atheism grows out of Christianity. And that's one of the things that Jordan Peterson asserts, that Nietzsche asserted, that Christianity in a sense cut its own throat, and that throat cutting is atheism.
Yeah. Well, hopefully we can bind that wound. I'm telling you, just a throat injury is not the end of the world, guys. We got bandages here. Drew, do we have a lot of questions? We have about maybe 10, 20 minutes left. So just be mindful of our time.
Yeah, we have a lot of questions. We got a couple more super chats, so I'll start with those. A couple of the super chats aren't questions, but I figured I could just read this off.
Yeah, go
quick
ahead.
So we can get to the questions. Okay, so this is from John Buck for $5. Everyone, be sure to tune in next week, where I'll be arguing Elon Musk's argument that we're most likely living inside a simulation.
I'm looking forward to that.
Yeah. Just Mercy for $5 says wish fulfillment is a false prerequisite for even a Christian God. A humble believer prays to change themselves, not everything else or God. Okay, and then we actually have a question from John Buck for $2. It says, sorry, Paul, I got to ask, what do you mean by agency?
Agency is very connected with reality, in that it's our power to affect change at every level in our world around us. And that desire to do so comes out of this mysterious center that we talk about as personhood. And I don't think this is something that we can finally penetrate, partly because it's inside of us and we can never really see ourselves clearly.
Are you a fan of Donald Hoffman? Because Donald Hoffman spells this out very easily. He says consciousness affects the world, and that changed world affects the consciousness, and that's really his. I mean, it's totally an evolutionary argument, but it's a very simple argument. I know a lot of theists turn to Donald Hoffman because he's kind of an anti-materialist. And how is this for over the top? The name of his new book is called A Case Against Reality.
Yeah.
So it's pretty amazing.
I do like, I'm quite interested in his work. I've seen some of his videos. I want to read his book. I wouldn't agree with it. I think his reality in the title of the book implies the kind of materialism that people usually associate with that word. And yes. I think reality is a much deeper sense of that which is finally, ultimately determines and determined.
All right, next question.
All right, so we got another super chat from Joe for €2. He says, Paul, is that which governs the source of reason?
Well, they're working you, Paul.
Job, he knows me too well. I would say that which governs ultimately is the source of reason. I think reason is one of the most powerful tools we have in our own agency of governing. And it's the power of that reason that I think energizes many to imagine that human beings can finally govern the world. But I'm skeptical of that because we're not even good at governing ourselves.
All right. We got another super chat from Tio for $2. Adam, do you believe in ghosts?
No, I don't believe in ghosts. No. And I chastise Jordan Peterson all the time for not looking in the trunk. You know his ghost story, how he says they heard something in the trunk, and I'm like, Jordan Peterson, you let a raccoon die in your trunk, for heaven's sake. Why didn't you look?
He has a couple ghost stories actually on the H3 podcast.
Yeah, I know.
That's right. And I have had a conversation with a person that was with Jordan Peterson in the room where all the drawers open in the haunted hotel.
Uh-huh.
And that person testified to me that, in fact, that really happened. But that person I talked to doesn't believe in ghosts. So I said, how can you account for those drawers opening? He says, funny stuff happens that we can't account for. So, there you go.
Nice.
Okay. All right. So there's no more super chats at the moment. Let's see.
Well, we have about 5 minutes left, so if there's
Yeah,
not
that's fine.
questions, we could probably just. Do you want to deliver kind of a closing argument, Paul, and then I'll do my best to deliver a closing argument. Actually, I think you went first. So what is it, Drew? Who?
Okay, so I have to explain this rule to you every time. So the way it works is whoever opens
Okay.
doesn't get to close.
Okay.
if
So
you
I
went
get to
first,
go
the first-
last. Nice.
Yes. That's
All
how it works.
right. That's when I
Well,
deal the death blow.
The laser eyes.
I hope you don't mind that I gave you laser eyes in the thumbnail, Paul. But
I love laser
I
eyes.
couldn't
Give me all the laser eyes you want. That's
I
cool.
gave you angel wings too. So, and I gave you the blue ones, which are for the good team.
Oh, awesome. Well, I think I stated my arguments well. I think our definition of real should be that which finally governs and controls and determines. That is what is most real, not necessarily the material level. And I think Adam and I both share the assertion that you can identify God as that which selects in a Jordan Petersonian way. And I would also assert that by watching human beings appreciating our agency, you can realistically imagine, and I believe that almost everyone acts as if there is also a personal God, which in fact does govern at a higher level than we do.
So, and my argument is that I don't believe that the supernatural God exists, but I do believe in the Jordan Peterson God exists. In Jordan Peterson's idea of the God, this evolutionary force. And I made the argument, and I want to just reiterate it, that I think a lot of the reason why Jordan Peterson is popular among atheists, former Christians, is because he's given them a materialist argument for why these traditions are valuable. And it's a very, very good argument that's difficult to contend with. I think one of the reasons why the anti-theists, and I separate the anti-theists from the atheists like myself, the ones that believe religion is evil, that religion needs to be destroyed, those people, they can't. One of the reasons why they detest Jordan Peterson is because his arguments are very rational. They're based in a materialist worldview, and they're difficult to refute. They're very difficult to refute. One of the reasons why I want to have conversations with intelligent Christians like Paul here and other intelligent Christians is because I think these are your best arguments to combat anti-theism, which there's an argument to be made that it's just a form of nihilism. So when you undermine the materialist worldview, which is very much a Jordan Peterson worldview, I think you are undermining arguments that would be very beneficial to use against this creeping nihilism. So that's my closing argument. Do you want to say anything? Do you want to promote anything, Paul, before we go?
I'm just happy to be here. This is fun.
Yeah, so Paul might do another debate. So let us know in the comments below if there's anyone that you think would be a good debate match for Paul. And Paul's a good sport, man. He would love to do debates. I mean, there's a lot of atheists out there. There's a lot of anti-theists out there. So it'd be interesting to have him back on the channel. Drew, do you want to promote anything?
Yeah, go to my YouTube channel. It's just Drew Welty on YouTube if you want to check out more of my stuff. I'm probably going to upload some research oriented stuff. I've been compiling a pretty big list of citations, so I'll probably make some videos in detail about moral foundations theory soon. So yeah,
Cool.
Go check it out.
Yeah, cool. Drew's a fan of Jonathan Haidt and a moral foundations theory guy. He's a psychology grad, so go ahead and subscribe to his channel. He's been a lot of help with me, just moderating and help me produce shows. So this was a lot of fun. I thank you again, Paul, and we will see you in the next video.